John, thank you. I'll let you grab a sip of water, but that was fantastic and fascinating, and raises, well, I mean, I've got a page worth of questions, and I won't ask them all because I want to bring everybody else in at some point. But let me just ask. A lot of this is predicated on work that you've done with your membership. Consultation. I don't know what. Just tell us a little bit more about that process and how you've gone about, if you like, gathering and coming to this view that is sort of cautious optimism, if I might put it in those terms. Just tell us a bit about the process that's led you to this speech.
It's a really good question. How does the CBI get its mandate? We have our own CBI version of a big tent debate. We don't tend to have votes, we don't tend to have polls, we don't tend to ask people to tick a box. What we do is ask people to come together. And CBI speaks for 190,000 businesses, so it's a big responsibility to get that right. The way we do it, and there's people in this room involved directly in the process, is we have 12 elected councils that are regional across the Celtic nations and the English regions. And they're sort of C-suite, by which I mean most of the people in the room are owner-managers or chief executives or top-level directors of larger companies, if they're not the ultimate global chief executive. And they're elected. They're elected by the rest of the CBI membership. And that's our grassroots parliament. It's our version of Westminster. It meets in 12 chapters across the country, and it's about 600 women and men leading British companies. And those people need to reflect the broad range of the 190,000. Of course, we're a confederation. I can't talk to 190,000 businesses. I just wouldn't have the time to get to all of them. We have 140 trade associations that are sectorally based. So the British Retail Consortium or the Chemical Industries Association. And they're hugely important to that mandating process. And they have their own trade association council. And then we have a small business council. And the small business council, Ed, can act as a star chamber. It can look at anything CBI is doing, and it can say, don't like that because you didn't think small firm first. You combine those together. We spend hours and hours and hours, particularly through Nicola's work, debating these issues. We don't jump to conclusions. That's why I don't like tick box surveys. We ask people to think deeply about the issue. And then all of that comes into the CBI board, and then we decide what was the balance of the view. So there's quite a process, so that when we speak with strength. And I think what a lot of those people have said is, something's happening and it's happening very quickly and it's primarily determined by politicians. We feel we're in a bit of catch-up. We don't know quite what the implications are. Tell us more. But until we're quite convinced, we'll be a little bit cautious. And for goodness sake, CBI, wave the flag for this doing something for people's living standards.
Right.
Because it mustn't just be another debate
that's
about deck chairs on the
ask.
Titanic.
That's what I wanted to ask, because I think another question, just to put all of this in context, is where does devolution come when you talk to your members in their kind of range of concerns? Because we hear a lot about skills, access to finance, industrial policy around different sectors and so on. But does devolution sort of play large, or does it cut across all of these things, and do people see the relationship between the two?
So when you talk to an entrepreneur, I find the first thing is what she or he wants to talk to you about, and then the second thing is what they feel they need to talk to you about.
Right.
The things that jump off the page, education, always education and skills, because in the long term, that's the most important thing we can do to improve the effectiveness of the economy in the country. People often want to talk about infrastructure, particularly at the moment. And then you come to the things they feel they need to talk about, and they need to talk about political uncertainty, because that's high on their risk register, actually. For lots of companies, it's now actually a risk register issue. And then they'll talk about devolution because of its uncertainty. That doesn't mean they're being negative.
Yeah.
But from an entrepreneur's point of view, they don't wake up thinking about devolution.
But when they talk about skills and when they talk about infrastructure and transport and so on, do they make that connection with the fact that, because I often talk to businesses who say the problem is we can't get the skills that we want. For me, the solution is the problem is too much of our skills strategy is determined from on high, and we can't get employers close enough to colleges and so on in such a way as to make that skill system work locally. Now that for me is where devolution becomes real in addressing those issues.
So that's where Nicola comes in, because I don't think Nicola, they immediately make the connection, do they? But they can be persuaded of it quite rapidly. because they want the thing solved, and they want a better solution on apprenticeship funding, and they want a better solution on filling potholes in the winter.
And transport.
Yeah, on Manchester's roads than they're getting currently. But they need to be persuaded that the alternative is more efficient.
Sure,
Yeah?
sure. And I hear what you're saying about concerns that devolution is in some ways a political project, but you've expressed that in two ways, and I just want to tease this out a little bit. You've talked about devolution by deadline and this kind of fear of the speed of devolution, and also these kind of backroom deals that seem to be taking place. I think we're all slightly cautious of and worried about. And so I get my question is it really the speed, or is it the transparency of what's going on, which is the problem here?
So I think the two relate to each other, so I'm fudging my answer. So I actually think what's happened in Scotland since the 18th of September, I think has been pretty impressive as a process. It was pretty much, we've got to get on with it, there wasn't much choice, but there has been an open process. I'm not sure the evidence is quite as strong in relation to the debate in Wales. There's a similar deadline, St David's Day, which is looming now. It's only 10 days away. But actually, it's been very much a behind closed doors debate between Welsh politicians and UK politicians with responsibility for Wales. I think it's been not a big tent debate. And some of the sort of city deals we've had announced, you look at them, they're good, there's no problem. And look at the Manchester one, looks a good package. But it seems to be driven by the opportunity for big statements on particular days. Yeah? So can we get a minister to come to a northern city to say something big? I mean, we get politics, you know, we're not naive in the business community. We know that's life as it is, but it doesn't always lead to the
Manchester
best.
would say that the local enterprise partnership has been involved in all those conversations and so on. Are you suggesting that's not the case, or that more should be done to involve business?
So I tried in my speech, not just because it's the best way to get out of Manchester alive, to say that what's happening in Manchester is good.
Fine.
And I think it is good. And I've got a stake in this. My wife comes from Salford, so I feel partially a citizen up here. In that regard, I think Manchester is a beacon of good practice. But even here, there are lots of implications and consequences, because are we going to end up with an untidy map? Are a few cities going to become beacons?
Right.
Yeah. What happens across the boundary from the Manchester Combined Authority? What happens in Cheshire and in Lancashire? What happens in Liverpool? Do we need a tidy map where all the ships in the convoy move at the same speed? Or is it better to let some ships just speed ahead? There's always a consequence there,
And you know that we advocate asymmetrical devolution, in other words, different places moving at different speeds. But, and this is, I think, a place where we, if you like, concur with you, that there needs to be a plan for everywhere. So even if we are going to allow some places to move off, there's still another. You know, everybody knows where they fit within the system, and at the moment, I would agree with you that we don't see enough of that. Two more little things, if I might, before I bring everybody else in. You talked about one of your criteria being around minimising bureaucracy. Can I read between the lines here and sense that your members are suggesting that more devolution means more bureaucracy? Is that essentially what's being said?
You don't find many politicians who say the best possible thing they can do while they've got power is to keep out the way. So the net result is you tend to get more initiatives, and we're much better at announcing new things than we are about taking out old things. I'm encouraged by combined authorities, as I know you are, and IPPR North is. I mean, this is a relatively new development. It's still bedding in. We've really only got them in metropolitan areas, haven't we? We've really only got them in unitary authorities. So whether they can work across the country, I think, is still an open question. But at least there's an effort to work across local authority boundaries for greater purpose. But heck, we still haven't got unitary authorities in most parts of the country. And if you look at the level of cuts that local authorities have already had, and the likely cuts that lie ahead, I think we've too many local authority chief executives, we've too many town halls, we've too many, parts of the country where one local authority empties your bin and another local authority fills the potholes. I think we probably need to simplify. And I guess if we were doing this devolution project in a company, if it was a company project, you'd have a budget, and that budget would be an absolute, and the objective would be to get more output for a smaller amount of input. I don't see within this big political debate that efficiency drive is central. Yet we're actually taking local authority staff away from their day job, which is dealing with public spending cuts, to sit on projects to do more things with devolution. The two agendas need linking together.
Absolutely, and I think you'd hear in Manchester, people talk about economic growth and public service reform as being two sides of the same coin, and precisely that happening. But you can also see the democratic fears around that sort of, if you're doing away with politicians, you're doing away with accountability, you're back to your backroom deals then, and there's concerns there. So it's an interesting one, and there'll be some tensions. Now on fiscal devolution, you've hinted. I don't think we're as far apart as perhaps you're making out. But let me put it in these terms. As the boss of a big business, if I was to give you lots of responsibility, but without the ability to either raise or spend that money in the way in which you want to, that limits the way in which you're able to operate. And I hear, we've all heard what you've said around devolution and fiscal devolution in particular, but don't you think it is the case that if we're going to pass powers down to, and let's assume here good quality local leadership, but if we're going to pass powers down to good quality local leaders, that then they need to be trusted to raise and spend their own budgets?
So I think there's a huge debate to be had here, and there are some important tensions. This is one of the areas where there are real tensions between the democratic agenda, which I have every respect for as a citizen, as an individual I have really strong views about, and the business agenda. What I think is clear is that for most businesses in CBI's membership, including the small and medium, we're now trading in a global economy, a 24/7 global economy, where fragmentation of local rules affecting business goes against the grain of where the tide of history is taking us. I talked about the single market of the United Kingdom. We've then got the single market of the European Union, and we're now in the middle of negotiations to create an 800 million citizen single market transatlantic between the United States and Europe. That's the reality of the globalised economy, and I think governments, national governments, never mind local governments, have got to accept they can't stand in the way of that like King Canute.
Sure.
It just won't work any longer. But that doesn't mean that things that are relevant directly to the citizen can't be devolved. So you saw the CBI take a rather different view on the devolution of income tax to Scotland as part of the Smith review than we did to business taxation. I think business taxes need to reflect a globalised economy. Personal taxes are very much an issue of democracy and community.
Sure. And I just sort of mention here, you were very strong, and I think you're absolutely right about the need for evidence and to ensure. But part of the problem with evidence in this country around devolution is we don't have a counterfactual because we are incredibly centralised. So we have to look overseas really to see that. And I would want to make the case on fiscal devolution, particularly on tax raising powers. And let's remember here, the ability in this country, it's around about local government can control about 5% of its budget. Tony Travers will tell you it's 0% because even council tax is now effectively capped. So 5% compared to Germany or Sweden, where you've got 50 or 60%. And the evidence shows us that not only is there good evidence that it enables economic growth, but also you don't get these sort of scare scenarios that I think you touched on in your speech, that in fact there are strong European rules around tax harmonisation which prevent German federal states from undercutting each other. But in fact, the evidence shows that there's actually a race to the top, and there's a sense of the need to harmonise taxes rather than to cut them. So I would simply encourage your members to be aware of that international evidence which exists.
And that's the sort of thing where I think collaboration between IPPR and the CBI is very valuable. It's the beginning of a journey, and I think most of the entrepreneurs in the room would say, Ed, we're always up for discussing these things. We don't presume that we have all the answers, but the caution is there.
Sure.
And we need solutions that work for different parts of the United Kingdom. And there's some real low-hanging fruit, which is the stuff we do agree on, like allowing business rate retention and tax increment funding and these other things. Why don't we try the low-hanging fruit first? And maybe there'll be a bit of a distinction between the Celtic nations and the English regions. In the Celtic nations, where there's a much stronger sense of national identity, that connectivity between voting in the ballot box and paying the tax bill is even more important to a healthy democracy. I think in some parts of England, we're not at that point. So maybe it's a journey.
Sure. Sure. Well, I think at this point I'm going to open it out to everybody and see if there are questions or comments from the audience. Let's try and stick on themes if we can. We've got half an hour or so we don't need to jump around too much. Hopefully we'll be able to bring lots of different people in. Anybody want to kick off with a question? Yes, please. And could you say who you are and where you're from at the beginning of what you say? That'd be helpful.
Thanks. John McLaren from Fiscal Affairs Scotland. So you can probably see where I'm going. Just to bring up a couple of things that you mentioned about caution and the economic evidence has been cited by both of you. In terms of caution, I think it's fair to say that CBI has a history of caution on these things. I imagine in 98, 99 it wasn't pro-devolution. I can't remember exactly, but most business wasn't and was soundly trounced at the time of the election then for Scottish devolution. It was pretty much botched what happened last year in terms of its relationship with the referendum, having to give money and then take it back. And it seems to be pretty anti it at the minute, not completely anti, but pretty anti it. And certainly in Scotland, the relationship between the CBI and the Scottish government is truly appalling. It may be getting better now, but the dogs in the street know that they hate each other. So that's an issue in terms of how do you actually influence things rather than make things worse, for not just for yourself but for everybody. If you then say that caution is based on economic evidence, and here I'd slightly depart from what Ed said, I think the economic evidence on what fiscal autonomy or greater fiscal devolution does is neutral. There's some evidence for, some against. It doesn't show that it's worse if you have more, but it doesn't necessarily show it's better, so it's pretty neutral. The democratic evidence is pretty strong, I think, that it's liked. So, for example, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland would never go back to a position without their parliaments, even though there isn't strong evidence to show that their economy is doing an awful lot better. So I think those issues then take you to, because of the democratic things about wanting to have more ownership of running your own country, more responsibility, which are positive. But on the business side, I would have said that the positive thing would be the greater competition across the UK rather than unitary policies, whereas you were saying kind of the opposite. Okay. So, for example, for business, corporation tax, Northern Ireland, Scotland both want them to be reduced. You've seen an example recently with housing sales tax, where it's improved. Scotland moved first, then the UK, and then Scotland's moved again.
Great.
So I would have said that there's quite a lot of evidence there that actually, even though through the democratic process, that this can be a good thing rather than to be too cautious about it.
John, do you want to say a bit more about Scotland then, just in the context of those comments?
So I hope I was upfront in saying that this Big Tent debate that I think we need to have has a democratic element and an economic element. And CBI's job is to talk about the economic element, but we respect the fact that the final decisions are about democracy. And frankly, that's where it got difficult in Scotland over the years, and particularly last year, because we do have a point of view on the economics, and as an organisation we have a responsibility to voice it, but we got caught up in some of the political issues which were about democracy and nationalism, which we have every respect for, but it got quite challenging at points last year, and we didn't cover ourselves in glory on one or two things. We've made a new start. We have a new director, CBI Scotland, who I launched in Glasgow in January, and we are opening up a dialogue. And I think evidence of that, evidence of learning from the past and applying it better. You've seen the CBI strongly support the consensus on the Smith Commission. We didn't seek to in any way hold back the force of history there. And I think that is an example, and I said it in my speech, of pretty good devolution process. The timescales were tight, but I think there's a good result there. And clearly there'll be a bit of politicking around that because politicians have to differentiate themselves. But actually, there is a process that will lead to real extra powers that the people of Scotland will be able to use to good effect, and we accept that. More generally, I think all we're saying is let's have that debate very openly, and the CBI will come to the table without preconceived notions, but we want others to come to the table without preconceived notions, because as you say, on the debate on fiscal autonomy and how it relates to growth, we're still in the foothills of understanding the implications. We need a lot more research to fully understand that. I think at this point, the thing we are most cautious on, and I won't fudge this, is the devolution of business tax raising powers. The big taxes. I'm particularly thinking of corporation tax.
Yeah.
And I've said why I think that doesn't fit with the model of a successful united economic kingdom. But that's a debate that's going to run long and hard.
Jim and Andy, we'll have one and then the other, please.
Jim Hancock, I used to be the BBC's North West political editor. I now work with an organisation called Downtown in Business. John, I'm not trying to trap you into supporting Labour's proposal for a constitutional convention, but doesn't it have merit? A, because it would allow you to have your say along with everybody else. It would deal perhaps with this speed issue, and it would also perhaps deal with something that's really bedeviled this whole question from the point of view of business, which is the hodgepodge way in which we've conducted reform of local government and everything else. And at the current time, we have elected mayors, we have talk about city regions, county regions, north of England body, which I would support. And there are other things to be dealt with as well, which are beyond the CBI's interest, which is the House of Lords and so on. So isn't the answer to have a time-limited, and that's important, constitutional convention where the CBI and everybody else can have their say, and we can try and devise a model which includes business support and everything else that you've talked about? Doesn't that have some merit, and would you explicitly support a constitutional convention?
Just hang on.
Yes.
Andy, do you want to come in as well?
Hi, Andy Mycock, University of Huddersfield. I think it's appropriate. I think it's a very positive move that the IPPR North and the CBI have come together and actually brought the business view. I'm a political scientist, and I think that at the moment one of the problems with the debate is that it's skewed towards politics. It does sound like you are erring towards a constitutional convention. I would have tried to trap him, Jim. I think you were being far too kind. A question about tax varying versus tax retention powers. At the start of your speech, you were quite right in saying that there is a need to try and uniformly raise economic development across England, across the United Kingdom. To what extent do tax retention powers potentially actually embed inequality, whereas more successful parts of the country, and particularly I'm thinking about in London at the moment, the debate is about retaining more taxation in London and the South East. Tax retention would seem to potentially solidify that. And more importantly, it also, in some senses, allows central government to keep its heavy hand on rates of taxation and possibly, therefore, constrain economic development.
Okay, two. I think.
Okay, let me take those two. I'll take them in the reverse order. If I was talking about devolution for a purpose, I'd like to talk about tax for a purpose. So let me give you a specific example, because Ed, you said, do business people wake up thinking about devolution? And the answer's no, but they do wake up thinking about making their businesses more successful, being able to employ more people. So if you look at one of the public policy challenges that the country has, and I was discussing it with some delegates over the breakfast, we need to build more houses in this country. Pretty much everybody is agreed on that. Tax for a purpose. Tax retention powers will help local communities to be convinced that there's an upside from allowing the green field at the end of our road to be built on so that our children have somewhere to live. Otherwise, we're all NIMBYs if we have to be. If you allow a community to get some benefit out of building reluctantly on that field, then the community will move forward. And I would say that's true across the country. Yeah, I don't want to build in more inequality. I hope Boris Johnson's not listening, but my objective in this isn't to just keep London moving ever further ahead of the rest of the country. London will be successful without these policies because it's a world dynamo. I mean, I'm a historian by background. I often describe London as an ancient Greek-style city-state. Yeah, it sort of operates without the rest of the country in many ways. So I don't think that we should design policies with London in mind. I think specifically, I think the point is, will it help the North? Will it help the West? Will it help the Midlands? And I think tax retention can give a sense of permission to democratically elected politicians to do things which communities might instinctively not see any upside in. But I agree that we mustn't let it produce even more inequality, because I don't think it's a north-south divide anymore. I think it's London and the rest of the country, frankly.
If I may, John, I mean, I think one of the answers to that, and it's done very successfully across most developed nations, is that you still need, even with tax retention powers or tax raising powers, you still need a national process of redistribution and equalisation. The problem at the moment is that is very, very befuddled in this country, and it kind of works, but it doesn't offer very many incentives for growth. And I think we could unlock that, and we could see the fiscal devolution, but within a framework of equalisation. I think that is possible. Sorry, Constitutional Convention.
On the first question, I am acutely conscious that we're in a regulated period under the Lobbying Act in advance of the general election. So I will be acutely careful in commenting on the policies of any political party. Let me say I'm always really pleased when any politician agrees with the CBI.
Any more questions, please? Yeah, this lady over here.
Colin Perry from LT Scientific. We're actually a manufacturer, so dare I say we come from the real world as opposed from the communications or media world. And I would like to echo 2 points of caution and perhaps get John's and Ed's comments on that. First of all, my neighbour here talked about a constitutional conference or federation. That is a way to create enormous bureaucracy, because the politicians will go for the biggest powers they can get and the largest employment they can get. A more constructive approach, I think, to devolution or decentralisation is an incremental one. Areas should prove themselves ready for devolution before they get it. And for example, you could have a series of tests to prove that a region was devolution ready. So that would be, I would prefer the incremental approach to the Big Bang approach. My second area of caution was something that my gentleman from Scotland mentioned about competition between regions. We have to be awfully careful to maintain the single market in this country. And I think, John, at the beginning of your talk, you emphasised that. There is competition and there's unfair competition. And it's important that we are very careful that we don't get into areas of unfair competition where a company in one region is unable to compete with a company in another region. Thank you.
Great. And then, yes, please.
Adele Reynolds, New Economy. We're the organisation that's charged with making sure devolution in Manchester is based on a strong evidence base, so really welcome and hear some of those arguments. My question to John is whether you've got a view on devolution of powers and responsibilities around business support to local areas, so having some of those programmes that support businesses to grow designed and delivered locally rather than large national programmes, and whether your members have expressed any views on that.
Okay, well, Colin, on your points, I'm absolutely with you. I think piloting, trying things, learning from experience, and then moving on and replicating is good. And I think there is an aspect of confidence building here. I think some of the caution from business, Ed, is that we want to be convinced that these things can be done well, and then we'll be more open to doing more of them. And I think your point on healthy and unhealthy competition is really important. We do not want a situation where factories open and shut simply because of incentives that are not commercially based. And business can game these things just as much as anybody else, and it's not a route that leads to a good outcome. I always remember in a visit to North Wales visiting a really good advanced manufacturing factory at the very bottom of Mount Snowdon and asking the chief executive why this fantastic manufacturing facility was where it was. And the answer was that the previous chief executive was a mountain climber. And that's what happens when decisions are made for non-commercial, non-market-based reasons. On business support, what actually most of my smaller businesses say to us is they're totally confused by business support, that they see an alphabet soup of initiatives, national and local, and they want a portal, they want a simple point of access. That's not a very helpful answer to you, because that doesn't necessarily mean that we should have lots more schemes. I think what is very clear is that we need the best possible marketing approach to making these things genuinely accessible. It doesn't seem to me impossible that certain things that need to be genuinely national are genuinely national in business support, and then there's the flexibility to do other things locally. So if I give an example, if we want more people to export and more growing companies to export, I would argue we need more innovative business support products in finance. We need better hedging, better export bonds. That's probably, in a globalized economy, if we're talking about products that are needed in Indonesia, better done nationally than it is by the Foreign Office and UKTI and Export Finance than it is by an agency in Manchester or one in Bognor Regis. But if we're talking about support for innovation, collaboration between the Northwest's and Manchester's universities and local small businesses, through things like innovation vouchers, I don't see why innovation vouchers need to be the same across the whole country. Working with Lancaster University might be completely different from working with Oxford Brookes and might need a local bespoke solution that you design here in Manchester.
So again, it's this horses for courses debate, and again, it's a big theme of our Decentralisation Decade report, is that you need to get the right things at the right level. I think that's key. May I just have a quick word about the incrementalism, because I think there are some risks around a too incremental approach, the thing that I hear most commonly around the incremental approach, and don't misunderstand me, we have set out a 10-year plan which is incremental, so I'm not talking against incrementalism overall, and neither am I talking against the need to prove your ability to take on these powers and the safeguards that are needed around that. But the dangers of incrementalism is that you don't see the real benefits of devolution if you're only devolving very small pockets and packages of services at any given point in time. If we really wanted to, for example, forgive me for talking about public services now, but if we really want to see improvements around the way we deal with people with the most complex needs, you can't just devolve one little bit of their care and then leave the rest with, say, the NHS. You need to devolve the whole care package, if you like, to get those efficiencies. So there are some risks around something which is too incremental. Any more questions? I think there were a couple of hands. Yes, please. This chap over here. There's somebody right at the back as well. Oh, great. Yeah.
Gentleman there first. Yeah.
Yes, good morning. My name is Martin Venning, and I'm a management consultant, and I want to come back to this issue of leadership. And I take your point that small business is very confused by the way the landscape looks at the moment. So the question is this: if we are to do something meaningful in the foreseeable future, and my limited understanding of what's going on here in Manchester is that in order for Manchester to get their devolution deal in effect, there's a need for primary legislation, which is obviously going to take some time to achieve. Are we really sort of dancing around the idea of further reform in local government? I took your point, John, that you actually said that in your view there was a clear case that there were too many local authorities and all of that. And I think most people who can actually stand outside a political position can recognise that. So the question is, we've all seen over the years how difficult and how long it has taken to achieve local government reform, are we actually saying that in order to start this incremental process more widely and accepting that there'll be different models that are right for different places, that we're really saying we need another bout of local government reform in order to kickstart this whole agenda?
Thank you. Yes, please, at the front.
Hi, I'm Teresa Broxton. I'm from First Group. My question is around leadership as well, really more into you, Ed. I think John had said around one of the things that the members of CBI are saying is better demonstration of leadership. And when you were talking about leadership, you used the word, let's assume that there's good leadership. So I wanted to ask as well, particularly when we look at evidence sort of like of other countries, what your thoughts are on the readiness and capability of leadership.
Sure. And John, you feel free to answer that one as well. There was a guy at the back. Can we just have the question from the... Thank you.
Hi, Alex Roy from McDonald's. John, you talked in favour of the uniform business rate, and I had a couple of questions about that. One, do your members actually understand that business rates are uniform and not set locally? I wonder whether they do. And also the sort of downside of that in that local areas therefore have much less ability to vary rates downwards as well as upwards, because you talked about upward pressure on business rates, but things like high street business rates being set up at a level that's unsustainable for those high streets is a big problem in Greater Manchester and elsewhere. And just the second point is, if we do have devolution, what do you think the correct role of business should be within that process once it's actually rolled out, not sort of determining what we should have, but once it happens?
Okay, let's have a crack at that. And again, I'll start with the last one. Gosh, a lot needs doing with the UK's system of business rates. It needs reform. It's become, now that corporation tax has been reduced, it's become probably the biggest business tax issue. But I would argue that the problems with the business rate system are problems across the whole country, and the right way to resolve them would be resolving them through a national solution. So you can't have a situation where revaluations of properties, and this is particularly relevant to your high street point, get so out of alignment with real rents and not expect it to have deep damage on high streets pretty much all over the country. You can't have one element of taxation going up by RPI when pretty much everything else that's within an entrepreneur's control at most goes up by CPI, and if you're trying to pass on a price increase, no increase at all. So there are fundamental problems with business rates that I think need addressing, and I think national solutions for those. I'm very supportive of business rate retention, but I'm nervous that more local councillors, forgive me, would be inclined to put business rates up than would be inclined to put them down. On the leadership issue, gosh, one former Director General of the CBI, his retirement job was Chairman of the Local Government Commission. I'm thinking of Sir John Bannon, who used to be my boss, made me a Director of the CBI indeed. And he probably still bears the scars of local government reforms. It's a bit like Colin's point about a convention on the Constitution. I think the better way is to really push local authorities to collaborate, cooperate. I think we've seen with combined authority here in Manchester that if there's a will, there's a way. And I think in that regard, community budgets are really important, and that goes beyond local authorities. It's about different public agencies, probation services, housing departments, fire departments, actually saying we're all serving the same families, so why don't we pool the money and use it more effectively? So I think I'm a little bit like Colin's incrementalism. Let's try some things and see if they work. Where I would perhaps argue that we need some legislation is, I think when you have the level of cuts in local government we've had, some of the smaller district authorities here in the northwest of England are just becoming so small now, I don't think they're viable.
I think I would share that point. I think we are having local government reform by stealth, and I don't mean that in the kind of crudest sense of unitarisation, which is very often where the conversation goes. I think the reductions to council budgets in the last 5 years, on top of all of the changes that took place in the 15 years preceding that have meant essentially we're not really seeing reform, but we're seeing the death of local government in many respects. And when you then throw adult social care and what might happen to that if that goes to health into the pot as well, then I think other than the very strongest local authorities and combined authorities, there are big questions about the viability of local government going forward. I've heard CLG officials in the past week talk about local government as a democratic overhead. And I think that raises some huge questions for us as a democracy as to where that goes. But it plays very much into the point that you made about leadership. And unfortunately, the consequence of what's happened to local government over the past 20 years is that we have, I think, massively destroyed really the strength of local leadership because local government has had such a weakening role to play. The question is, of course, can you build that up, and how do you build that up, and how do you, the way I talk about it is how do you redistribute capacity, which is now at the centre, across the regions and to local government, because it's not that we don't have capacity in the system, it's just that it's all located in London. And so it's how you actually push that, grow the leadership locally, push the powers down so that it's right that people want to come up. If you take Manchester's cohort of councillors are great, a really diverse young bunch of up-and-coming politicians and the business people in their own right, and that's because Manchester is seen to be a good place to be a councillor. I think as you push the powers down, so you'll get better people with higher capacity coming up. So I have to be optimistic about that situation. Otherwise, we'd be so dismal that we would actually just completely centralise the nation once and for all.
And Ed, I didn't answer our colleague from Mott MacDonald's question on business leadership when we get beyond the election in this big tent debate we were describing. Clearly there's lots of ways that can be demonstrated and the CBI has a role to play. But I think the primary thing we need to build on are the LEPs. I think the LEPs are the basis. For a long while, LEPs were quite embryonic. I think there are some beacons of best practice in the LEPs, and I think it's much better to build on what we have than have another bout of let's scrap one thing and start with something else.
And real clarity about the role of LEPs in their relationship to combined authorities, I think, is key. I think one more round of questions I think we can manage. So, yes, please. There.
Anirudh Mandagiri, Institute of Economic Affairs. On the LEPs, currently 7% of SMEs have said they found the LEPs actually useful. Why do you think that's so, and how can it be improved? How can the relationship be improved?
That's quite a high figure, actually. I think they'd probably say the same about government, and they might even say the same about the CBI. And I'm not being flippant here. I've spent a lot of years in government committees trying to find ways with business support programs and many other things of reaching the 3 million small businesses in Britain. And it's a laudable objective when you're talking of micro businesses, but the reality is you're always only going to get to a certain percentage. So LEPs have had very limited powers, they've had very limited budgets, and it doesn't surprise me that they're not on the radar screen of entrepreneurs at the very smallest level who are just keeping their businesses alive. We know that the best way to reach those very small businesses are through the only people that those very small businesses have to have a relationship with. They have to have a relationship with their accountant, and they have to have a relationship with their bank. And I think you've got to work through the intermediaries that are essential. And again, I'm not being flippant, but at the very, very smallest level, you're likely to meet your local entrepreneur in the pub on a Friday night, and that might be the one moment in the week when she or he has time to listen to something that isn't to do with keeping their business successful. So I think, reaching these companies from a distance, great, we should try and do it, but heck, it's always going to be a percentage share.
Sure. John, you've been incredibly generous with your thoughts and your comments this morning, and we're very, very grateful to you for that, and to the CBI more generally for the excellent work that it's been doing on the devolution agenda, and I look forward to further partnership going forward. I asked a question at the beginning about Eagle Comics and how many Eagle comics John has got, and I don't want to forget that before we all leave. So, hands up, who thinks between 1950 and 1969...
Indeed.
in John's collection of Eagle comments, there are, you've got three choices: less than 500, 500 to 1,000, or more than 1,000 comics in John's collection of Eagle comics. Okay, so hands up, less than 500? Ooh. 500 to 1,000?
It's mainly the men answering, I'm noticing.
More than 1,000. Very good. Well, the answer is John?
991.
There you go. Listen, thank you all very much for coming. It's been a really, really stimulating morning. I hope that it gives you plenty of food for thought. I hope we can see a greater business voice in the debates about devolution. And I do hope you have a great rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you.